My name is Helen Garvey, and until recently, I thought I'd seen every kind of betrayal a mother could experience. I'm 72 years old, and for the last 40 years, I've lived on a peaceful, sun-drenched ranch in Southern California. A ranch my late husband Frank and I built from nothing but dirt and dreams. That land raised our kids, healed our griefs, and kept my hands busy through a lifetime of seasons. I buried Frank under the apple tree near the northern fence, like he always said he wanted, next to where the sunrise hits first. Now that same land is gone, sold right out from under me by the very daughter I nursed through chickenpox, heartbreaks, and every scraped knee of her life. Her name is Lacey, and she used to be the best part of me. Used to be. This story is about what she did, what she took, and the mistake she made thinking her old mama wouldn't fight back. It started 3 Tuesdays ago with a knock at my door I never should have answered. If you have a similar story about betrayal from the people you least expect, tell us in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. When I opened the door, there stood Lacey, all dressed up in one of those sleek business suits that make women look like glass statues. All shine, no warmth. She wasn't alone. Her fiancé, Paul, stood behind her with that fake grin he wears like cologne, too strong and sickening. "Mom," Lacey said, stepping forward like she had good news. "We have something exciting to tell you." My stomach dropped, because excitement in her voice usually meant trouble for me. I stepped aside and let them in, wiping my hands on the dish towel tucked in my waistband. Paul made himself at home on the leather armchair Frank always used, crossing his legs like he was the king of something. "Is this about that job in San Francisco?" I asked, though I already knew it wasn't. Lacey looked at Paul, then pulled an envelope from her bag. "Actually," she said, sliding it across the table, "we sold the ranch." I stared at the envelope like it was radioactive. "You what?" My voice didn't even sound like mine. "It's all official," Paul added, nodding toward the paper like it was a birthday card. Lacey had power of attorney, totally above board. I didn't remember signing anything like that. "This is your share after taxes and commissions," Lacey said, tapping the envelope. I opened it with shaking hands and pulled out a check. $16,000. My name on the line, like a cruel joke. "To help you get settled somewhere more manageable," she added, as if she was doing me a favor. For a second, all I could do was stare at her, my daughter, who once cried when I pulled her first loose tooth, now smiling as she handed me the leftover crumbs of my own life. "You sold my home," I said, each word sharp and dry in my throat. "You sold it without telling me, and now you hand me this, like I'm some stranger." Paul cleared his throat. "Lacey has power of attorney. You had that health scare last year, remember?" I remembered the flu, not handing over control of my life. "Doctor said you weren't thinking clearly at the time," Lacey added, avoiding my eyes. "This is for your own good, Mom." "My own good?" I laughed then, and it sounded like breaking glass. "You have no idea what you've just done." They looked at me like I'd lost my marbles. A look I've seen on teenagers right before they realize their teacher isn't as dumb as she looks. "Mom, we really think you'll be happier in a retirement community," Lacey said, trying to soften it now, like that would dull the betrayal. "There's one, with a pool and group painting classes. You love painting." Paul stood and adjusted his designer blazer like the matter was settled. "We've arranged a place. You can move in this weekend." I didn't answer. I just picked up the envelope and walked out the back door, letting the screen slam behind me. I needed air. I needed dirt under my boots. I needed to breathe in what little of my life still remained. I walked straight to the barn, where Frank's tools still hung like they were waiting for him to come home. The dust motes in the sunlight looked like ghosts, tiny pieces of memory floating in the quiet. I stood there and let the silence wrap around me like armor. I wasn't going to cry. Not here. Not yet. My daughter had just sold my life's work for pennies and expected me to thank her. I thought about the paperwork, the power of attorney, the way she said doctor's orders, like she was reading from a playbook. And that's when it hit me. If Lacey had forged my signature or tricked me into signing something I didn't understand, then maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as legal as they thought it was. Back inside, I pulled out the folder she'd left on the counter, full of documents and realtor flyers. I spread them out across the kitchen table like puzzle pieces, hunting for anything out of place. There it was, the notary stamp on the power of attorney, signed 6 months ago. I remember that week clearly. I had the flu, Lacey brought soup, and I was too tired to argue about anything. But I sure as hell didn't sign away my future. I traced the signature on the document with my finger, comparing it to my real signature on a checkbook. The H in Helen was wrong. My loop always dipped lower. This wasn't just betrayal. This was fraud. I needed help, and I knew just who to call. My neighbor 2 properties over, Miss Arlene, had been a paralegal for 30 years before she retired. She was the kind of woman who wore cowboy boots with her church dress and kept a loaded shotgun under her bed, just in case. She answered on the first ring. "Helen, what's wrong?" I told her everything, from the fake signature to the insulting check. By the end of it, her voice had a steel edge I hadn't heard in years. "I'm coming over. And bring the papers." 15 minutes later, she stood in my kitchen, glasses perched on her nose and red lipstick on like she was going into battle. Arlene flipped through the documents with the intensity of a prosecutor on her best day. "This isn't just shady," she muttered. "It's downright criminal." I watched her eyes narrow as she examined the notary stamp. "Well, look at that. This notary hasn't been active since 2020. It's 2025, Helen. This is a dead stamp." My heart pounded. "You mean it's invalid?" She nodded, face grim. "More than invalid. It's forged. And if they file this with the county, we've got a real case." I felt a flicker of hope, cold and cautious. "So what do we do?" Arlene closed the folder and looked me dead in the eye. "We fight." Arlene wasted no time. Within an hour, she had 3 pages of notes, a yellow legal pad filled with bullet points and arrows. "First, we document everything," she said, flipping through my dusty filing cabinet for anything with my signature. "If they forged this one, they might have messed up others too. We found property tax records, old bank statements, my will, and a medical directive from 2 years ago, all signed in ink. My ink." Arlene laid them side by side with the power of attorney. "See here," she said, pointing at the loop in the H. "This forgery looks like a photocopy of a bad forgery." I stared at it, my stomach clenching like a fist. "How did I not see this coming?" I whispered, ashamed of my own blindness. Arlene didn't answer right away, just looked at me like she had something heavy sitting on her chest. "Because, Helen," she finally said, "we don't raise children expecting them to become strangers." The next morning, I put on my church shoes, the ones I saved for weddings, funerals, and raising hell, and drove straight to the sheriff's office. I brought every paper Arlene and I had marked up, along with a binder labeled Timeline of Deceit, because if nothing else, I was going to be organized. Sheriff Jim Mercer had known me since Frank and I bought the ranch in 1985, and he didn't hide his surprise when I told him why I was there. "Helen, are you sure about this?" he asked, flipping through the binder. "This is your daughter we're talking about." "No," I said firmly. "This is the woman who impersonated me, stole my land, and handed me hush money like it was kindness." His lips tightened, the way they always did when he knew the truth hurt more than the lie. "We'll need to start an official report," he said. "But if this checks out, we're talking about felony fraud, possibly elder abuse." "Good," I said. "Because I'm done being quiet." Sheriff Mercer brought in a county investigator named Dana Bell, a woman who looked like she hadn't smiled since the Reagan administration and didn't intend to start now. Dana asked questions like a machine gun firing at full speed, and I answered each one with a calm clarity that surprised even me. "Did you ever knowingly sign over power of attorney?" "No." "Were you aware of the sale before it happened?" "Not until the papers were on my kitchen table." "Did your daughter ever discuss moving you to assisted living before this?" "Not once." Dana scribbled notes without looking up, her pen moving like a blade carving truth from noise. "We'll need copies of medical records, especially anything around that so-called health scare." I nodded. "I'll have them by tomorrow." As I stood to leave, Dana finally looked up and said, "Helen, if what you're saying is true, they're in a world of trouble." Back at the ranch, or what used to be mine, I noticed a new sign staked near the mailbox. "Future site of Crimson Grove Estates, luxury living redefined." My blood ran cold. So that was their plan all along. Not a family looking to start a new life. Not a sweet retirement village for mama. No, they sold my soul to developers, the kind that pave over memories and call it progress. I stood there in the heat, the sound of cicadas buzzing like angry witnesses, and felt something inside me shift. Not sadness. Not even betrayal anymore. This was war. And I hadn't survived 72 years, a husband's death, and 2 miscarriages to lose everything to a daughter with a taste for granite countertops. That evening, I called my old friend Rosa, who worked for the local newspaper The Valley Voice, before it was bought by a media conglomerate and gutted for profit. Rosa still freelanced on the side, usually writing profiles on hometown heroes and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. But when I told her what had happened, she went quiet. "You're kidding," she said after a long pause. "Helen, this is huge." I heard her pull open a desk drawer on the other end of the line. "I've been looking into Crimson Grove for months. They've been snatching up land all over the county, mostly from elderly folks in sketchy deals." My stomach dropped. "You think Lacey and Paul are in on something bigger?" "I don't think," Rosa said. "I know. Meet me tomorrow. Bring everything." I hung up and whispered to the empty house, "Frank, I hope you're watching." The next morning, Rosa and I met at the diner where Frank used to take me every Friday morning, back when he still whistled as he shaved. She looked over the documents with the same reverence a priest gives confession. "This is exactly what I needed," she said, pulling out a voice recorder and setting it between us. "Let's start from the top." I told her everything. From Lacey's visit to the sheriff's office, every word carefully measured. "Crimson Grove's CEO is under investigation in Arizona for similar schemes," Rosa said, halfway through her 3rd cup of coffee. "They target the elderly, usually through family members who are in debt or greedy. Then they use shady lawyers to rush sales before anyone can object." I felt sick. "My daughter knew what she was doing." Rosa nodded, grim. "And now we're going to show everyone exactly who she is." By Thursday, Rosa's article was front-page news. The headline read, "Mother Betrayed, Local Ranch Sold in Alleged Power of Attorney Scam," and below it, a photo of me standing in front of the ranch gate, arms crossed and eyes full of fire. My phone rang nonstop all day. Some calls from neighbors, others from strangers who had been through something similar. A woman named Gail from 2 counties over said her son had forged her signature to sell her house, and she'd never been able to prove it. "You give me hope," she said, voice trembling, but not all the calls were kind. Lacey left 3 voicemails, each angrier than the last. "How could you do this to us?" she said on the 3rd. "You're humiliating your own daughter." I saved the messages and emailed them to Dana Bell with a subject line that read, "More evidence." The next week, I was summoned to a meeting at the county courthouse with the district attorney's office. Arlene came with me, dressed in her best blazer, looking like she was ready to cross-examine the devil himself. The DA, a young woman named Clara Cho, greeted us with a firm handshake and a folder the thickness of a small Bible. "We're opening a criminal investigation," she said without preamble. "Forgery, fraud, conspiracy. This is a textbook elder exploitation case." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "What happens next?" Clara looked at me with the kind of resolve that doesn't come from textbooks. "We subpoena the realtor, the notary, your daughter, and her fiancé, and we freeze the sale, effective immediately." "So I still own the ranch?" I asked, barely breathing. Clara smiled. "For now, and we're going to make sure it stays that way." The first time Lacey showed up after the article ran, she didn't knock. Just barged through the front door like she hadn't burned it all to the ground. "Mom, what the hell are you doing?" she snapped, her heels clicking across the wood floor like gunfire. I was in the living room, folding laundry, trying to pretend my heart wasn't galloping. "You should really call first," I said without looking up. "You're blowing this way out of proportion," she hissed, tossing her purse onto the couch like she still lived here. I folded a dish towel in half. "You forged my name, sold my home, and handed me pocket change. That's not a disagreement, Lacey. That's theft." Her eyes flared, but she kept her voice low. "Do you even know what kind of pressure we were under?" I did now, because betrayal always follows desperation. I stood up slowly, letting the towel fall from my hands. "Did you think I wouldn't fight back?" Lacey scoffed. "You're 72. We thought you'd be relieved not to worry about this place anymore." I let her words hang in the air like smoke, foul and lingering. Your father built this house with his bare hands, I said. He died on this land. And now you hand it over like it's a bad stock you're dumping before market close? She looked away, but I pressed. You knew about Crimson Grove. You and Paul didn't just sell my ranch. You sold your integrity. Her shoulders slumped just a little, the armor cracking. We needed the money, she said, and suddenly she sounded like the girl who once asked if monsters could live in closets. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I stayed calm, like Frank used to do when a horse spooked in a storm. Then you should have asked, I said, each word carefully measured. I'd have sold the old pickup, pawned jewelry, found some damn way to help. Lacey sat down hard on the couch and buried her face in her hands. Paul's in deep, she mumbled. Business loans, credit cards, investors threatening legal action. He said we'd be ruined if we didn't act fast. So you ruined me instead, I said quietly. That was the trade. She didn't answer, and I didn't expect her to. Paul called later that night, his voice stiff and full of forced charm. Helen, he began, as if trying to remind me I was still family. Let's talk about solutions, not problems. Then start by returning every cent of that sale, I said. Oh, come on, he chuckled nervously. You think this article and a few signatures will stop a development company like Crimson Grove? No, I replied, but the DA's subpoena might. His voice faltered, just for a second. We can make this go away, you know. Quietly. No courts, no scandal. I hung up before he could finish his sentence. That was his first mistake of the week. The next day, Dana Bell called with news that made my spine straighten like a flagpole. We've confirmed the notary was forged, she said. She died 3 years ago. I leaned against the kitchen counter, letting the gravity of that detail settle. The power of attorney is invalid, and since the sale was based on that document, it qualifies as fraudulent conveyance. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Does that mean I can get the ranch back? It's a strong start, she said. Now we need to tie Lacey and Paul directly to the forgery. Emails, texts, calls, anything that shows they knew it was fake. I thought of Paul's smug grin, the way he dismissed everything as a business transaction. I'll find it, I promised. Arlene and I turned the house upside down looking for tech devices, old papers, anything they might have used while planning their little heist. They probably used your Wi-Fi, she muttered, pulling the router log files onto my computer. Most people don't realize this thing records everything. We found Paul's laptop in the hall closet behind a box of holiday decorations. Sloppy, arrogant, or both. Arlene booted it up and whistled. Password protected, but not encrypted. We'll get into this by tomorrow. I made coffee while she worked, hands trembling only slightly now. I thought about Lacey's face when she said they were under pressure, and I wondered when exactly she stopped seeing me as her mother and started seeing me as leverage. Frank always said money doesn't change people. It just shows you who they really are. I was seeing Lacey clearly for the first time in years. That evening, Rosa showed up with a box of manila folders and a smile like a loaded gun. You're not going to believe what I found, she said. We spread the papers out on my dining table, a war map of deceit. Crimson Grove's CEO, Eric Dalton, is under federal investigation, Rosa said, tapping a document with highlighted lines. And guess who recently signed a consulting agreement with his company? She handed me a printout of a contract, Paul's name at the bottom, clear as daylight. He was paid $150,000 as a regional acquisitions consultant. To sell my land, I muttered, to betray me for a commission. Rosa nodded grimly. He was never your family, Helen. He was always theirs. By Friday, the DA filed a formal injunction to freeze the development. No bulldozers, no contracts, no changes to the property lines. I drove out to the edge of the ranch just before sunset, stood by the same apple tree where Frank's stone marker caught the last of the light. They almost paved over your grave, I whispered. Almost. I sat on the grass, knees creaking like the branches overhead, and let the quiet of the land hold me. The dirt was still mine for now, and as long as I had breath, I'd fight to keep it. Not for revenge, not even for legacy, but because home isn't something you sell when the bills get high. The next morning, Arlene cracked Paul's laptop wide open like a rotten nut. "He didn't even bother wiping the drive," she said, disgusted. "There are emails, Helen. Dozens of them." She pulled up one labeled, "Expedite Sale. Helen, unaware." My stomach turned. "It's from Paul to Dalton," she said. "He brags about using your flu recovery to push the forged documents through. Calls you, compliant by nature." My hands curled into fists. "Can we print that?" "Already done," Arlene said, holding up a thick sheaf. "This is what the DA needed. The intent is now provable." And just like that, the war had a new weapon, truth, printed in black and white. If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. District Attorney Clara Cho called me on Sunday morning, her voice sharp with urgency, even before I finished saying hello. "We've reviewed the emails from Paul's laptop," she said, cutting straight to business. "This is beyond elder fraud now. We're looking at wire fraud, conspiracy, and possibly racketeering if Dalton's network ties in." I leaned against the doorframe, looking out at the hills beyond the barn, wondering how many more secrets they could possibly hold. "What happens next?" I asked, steadying my voice. "We're issuing subpoenas for Dalton, Paul, and Lacey," Clara said. "They'll be called in for questioning this week. If they don't cooperate, we move to indictments." I didn't say anything for a moment, because hearing your child's name in the same breath as indictment is like swallowing nails. "We'll need you to testify," Clara added softly. "And I will," I said, louder than I expected, "because someone has to stand for what's right." Word spread fast in small towns, faster than lightning and twice as destructive. By Tuesday, I couldn't step into the grocery store without someone stopping to offer their opinion. "You're doing the right thing," Mr. McCarty from the post office told me, tipping his cap like we were in a Western. "Proud of you," said Betty Lou from church, handing me a pie I hadn't asked for but gladly took. But not everyone was cheering. The whispers started. Quiet, sharp-edged words from people who thought dirty laundry belonged behind closed doors. "I heard she's trying to ruin her own daughter," one woman murmured to another by the deli counter. "It's family, not court business," said someone else behind me at the gas station. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. Cowards never whisper when they're proud of what they're saying. I went home that afternoon and cried alone in my bathroom, where the judgment couldn't follow. That night, Lacey showed up again, but this time her eyes were rimmed red and her hands trembled when she spoke. "They served me papers," she said, stepping into the kitchen like it still belonged to her. "I'm going to lose everything." I didn't move from the table, didn't offer her tea or sympathy. "You already did," I said. "You just didn't realize it until now." Her face crumpled. "Mom, I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't know how bad it would get." "You forged my name," I said flatly. "You handed me a check for $16,000 and called it kindness." "Paul said it was temporary," she whispered. "That we'd make it up to you." I looked her dead in the eyes. "You can't make up for stealing someone's soul." She sat across from me like a ghost, shoulders hunched, voice barely audible. "I didn't read everything he gave me," she said. "I just signed where he pointed." I raised an eyebrow. "That's your defense? Ignorance?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "It's shame." For a moment, I believed her. I saw the little girl who used to sneak extra cookies from the jar and always confessed before bedtime. But shame doesn't undo harm. It doesn't put fences back up or unsigned contracts. "You'll need to talk to the DA," I told her. "If you want leniency, tell the truth. All of it." "What if I go to jail?" she asked, eyes wide and wet. "Then you face the consequences," I said, my voice steel, "like any adult who makes a choice and lives with it." The next morning, Clara called again. "Lacey came in last night," she said. "Told us everything. Emails, texts, who approached them, how the deal was sold to them as a sure thing." I closed my eyes and let the relief wash over me in cautious waves. "Did she admit to forging the documents?" "She claims Paul handled that part," Clara replied, "but we'll verify her role through digital forensics." What about Paul? I asked. Not a word from him yet, Clara said. And that's a problem, because if he runs, this gets messy. Let him run, I muttered, staring out at the horizon. He can't outrun the truth. Meanwhile, Rosa kept digging, and what she uncovered made even Arlene curse under her breath. Dalton has 6 shell companies under different names, Rosa said, pointing at a corkboard filled with names and red thread like something out of a detective movie. He's funneled property through each one to launder money and hide fraud. One company in particular, Oakvale Holdings, had purchased a property 2 counties over under nearly identical circumstances to mine. Elderly man, Rosa said. No family, forged documents, sold out from under him, died 2 weeks after the sale. Heart attack, they say. Or heartbreak, I murmured. We need to make this bigger, Rosa. People need to see. It's not just my story. She looked at me and nodded. Then let's make it national. By Friday, Clara's office filed formal charges, 3 counts of fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy, and 1 count of elder abuse, all tied to Paul. Lacey's name was notably absent from the charge sheet, pending further review of her cooperation. It's not a free pass, Clara told me, but it's a start toward redemption, if she follows through. I didn't go to the arraignment hearing, didn't want to see Paul stand in that courtroom with the same smug face he wore the day he handed me that check, but Arlene did, and she called me afterward. He pled not guilty, she said. Wants a trial. I didn't sigh, didn't frown, just smiled faintly as I poured myself coffee. Then we'll give him one. And we'll make sure the whole county watches. That evening, I stood by the fireplace, watching the flames flicker like old memories trying to relight. I thought about Frank, how he used to say that justice wasn't loud. It was patient, stubborn, and sharp like a thorn in the side of evil. I whispered his name into the quiet room, like it might carry through the walls and into whatever corner of the afterlife he occupied. We're getting it back, Frank, I said. The land, the truth, maybe even our daughter, if there's still something left to salvage. Outside, the wind rolled over the hills like a sigh too big for lungs. The porch light buzzed softly, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. This ranch wasn't just dirt and fencing. It was breath and memory, blood and bone. And it was mine, no matter who thought a piece of paper could change that. Paul didn't take the arrest well. The local news aired footage of him leaving the courthouse in handcuffs, shouting something about a setup and ungrateful women. I watched it on Arlene's TV with a cup of tea in my hand and zero sympathy in my chest. Look at him, Arlene muttered, pausing the screen on his red, sweaty face. He thought he was the puppeteer, but the strings got tangled around his own neck. I didn't say anything, just watched his image flicker, like a bad memory trying to survive in the light. You sure you're okay seeing this? She asked. I've never been more okay, I answered. The world was finally seeing Paul the way I always had, charming on the outside, rot underneath. He's going to fight this, Arlene warned, flipping the channel. Then I guess we'll fight harder, I said. 2 days later, I met with Clara and Dana at the courthouse to go over my official statement. They brought a stenographer, a recorder, and a stack of paperwork as thick as a phone book. Just answer every question truthfully, Dana said, even the ones that hurt. I nodded, sitting straighter in the chair, back as stiff as a fence post. Clara began with simple things. My name, my age, my ownership of the property. Then we moved into the meat of it. What happened that day in the kitchen when Paul and Lacey handed me the check? I told them about the envelope, the lies, the casual cruelty. And when did you first realize the documents were forged? Clara asked. When Arlene compared the notary stamps, I replied. But I knew in my gut the moment they walked through my door. The words felt like stones being laid in a foundation. Slow, heavy, and permanent. Later that night, Lacey showed up again, this time with a box in her hands. I brought your letters, she said, standing at the threshold like she was afraid the house might bite. I opened the screen door and took the box, peering inside to find dozens of envelopes, old Christmas cards, birthday notes, letters from Frank during his military service. Why did you have these? I asked. You gave them to me to scan a few years ago, she said, her voice small. I kept forgetting to return them. I moved aside and let her in, unsure if it was mercy or muscle memory that opened the door. We sat at the kitchen table, where everything had fallen apart. She watched me pull out one letter after another, my fingers brushing handwriting I hadn't seen in years. "I read them," she said quietly. "I shouldn't have, but I did." I looked up, eyes narrowed. "And did you learn anything?" She nodded, tears building. "Dad loved you more than anyone. He trusted you more than he ever trusted me." Her honesty cut deeper than any lie Paul had told. "You think I don't know that?" I whispered. "I raised you to be better, Lacey. Smarter, kinder, braver." She buried her face in her hands. "I don't know who I am anymore. You're the woman who made a mistake and is still breathing, which means you get to choose what happens next." I slid one of Frank's letters across the table. He always said forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means making peace with the memory. She stared at the letter, then at me. "Are you saying you forgive me?" I sighed. "I'm saying the door's open, but you'll have to walk through it." Meanwhile, Rosa's story had gone viral. Shared on national blogs, picked up by a cable news segment, even featured in a podcast about elder abuse and land scams. I listened to the episode alone, hearing my name spoken by strangers with tones of awe and fury. "Helen Garvey didn't just survive," the host said. "She turned the spotlight on corruption and made it burn." I wasn't used to being a symbol. I was just a woman who got angry enough to do something. Still, I couldn't deny the effect. Donations poured into a legal fund Clara had set up for elderly victims of financial abuse. Letters from people as far as Maine and Alaska found their way to my mailbox, each one telling a version of my story. I kept them in a shoebox under the bed, reading them when the weight of everything made my hands shake. Justice wasn't loud. Frank had been right, but it echoed in the hearts of people who needed to hear it. One morning, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. "Mrs. Garvey," the voice said. "This is Terry Malek from Crimson Grove's legal department." I stiffened. "I'd like to offer a settlement," he continued, "to resolve the matter privately." "I'm not interested in hush money," I said. "That's not what this is," he insisted. "We're offering to rescind the sale and transfer the deed back to you." "No court battle." I blinked, stunned into silence. "Why?" I asked. "Because," he said, lowering his voice, "you've made this toxic. Investors are pulling out. We'd rather cut our losses than deal with the press." I smiled, slow and satisfied. "Put it in writing." 3 days later, a courier arrived with the documents. Full title restoration, legal fees waived, development plans voided. I stood on my porch, pen in hand, and signed the papers like I was reclaiming my own name. "It's done," I whispered. The land was mine again, not just in memory, but in law. Arlene brought over champagne, and we drank it on the porch with our boots up and our hearts lighter than they'd been in months. "You did it," she said. "We did it," I corrected. "You never let me forget who I was." "No one can take that from you," she said. And for the first time in a long while, I believed it. The first morning, I woke up with the ranch officially back in my name. The sun felt different. Warmer, almost like it was saying welcome home. I brewed coffee the way Frank used to like it. Strong and a little bitter, and stood barefoot on the kitchen floor while it dripped. The air smelled like hay and earth and something close to peace. I walked outside in my robe and let the dew soak into my soles, toes curling into the grass that hadn't been flattened by construction trucks after all. I whispered a thank you to the land, even though I wasn't sure who or what I was thanking anymore. Arlene called before I'd finished my first cup. "Paperwork's been processed and recorded at the county level," she said. "Your title's untouchable now." "So they can't come for it again?" I asked. "Not unless they bring an army and a miracle," she answered, and I smiled. But just because I had the land didn't mean the storm was over. Clara warned me that Paul had hired a high-priced lawyer from Los Angeles, slick, well-dressed, and famous for burying cases and paperwork. "They're going to drag this out," she said. "He'll claim the forged documents were from an unreliable third party and that he trusted Lacey to handle everything." I felt my stomach clench, but I nodded. "Let him try," I said. "I've got every email, every recording, every damn lie he ever typed." Clara looked impressed. "We'll need character witnesses, too," she added. Neighbors, friends, people who can speak to your state of mind during the time they claimed you were incapacitated. I've got more of those than he's got fake receipts. I said, voice firm. I wasn't just defending a property. I was defending the truth of who I was. Dana Bell came out to the ranch to walk the property with me, a folder under one arm and a body camera clipped to her coat. Mind if we document everything? She asked. Go ahead, I said. This land's got nothing to hide. We started at the southern fence, where the first survey flags had been staked before the sale was blocked. They were planning to put the main road right through here, Dana said, gesturing toward the fields where Frank's cattle used to roam. It would have split the ranch in half. I swallowed hard. They didn't care about the land. They only saw numbers on a spreadsheet. We kept walking, the wind rustling the high grass, every step a reminder of what almost disappeared. I'm glad it's still yours, Dana said finally. Me too, I replied, meaning it with every bone in my body. A few days later, Rosa showed up with a new idea and that same mischievous fire in her eyes. I want to do a follow-up piece, she said, holding up her notepad like a sword. But this time, I want your voice leading it. What do you mean? I asked, curious. A first-person editorial, she explained. Let people hear your story in your own words, not a reporter's lens. Your lens. I hesitated. You think anyone really wants to hear more? She grinned. Helen, you're a hero to half the internet. People want to hear what a woman who got her land back has to say. I sat down and pulled out a pen. Then let's write it. The article dropped the next morning titled, You Don't Get to Steal From Me and Call It Help, a Rancher's Reclaiming. It started with my words. They thought I was old enough to be dismissed and too tired to fight. They were wrong on both counts. Within hours, it had over 500,000 views and counting. People commented by the thousands. Some angry, some inspired, many saying they'd experienced something similar. The part that seemed to hit hardest was when I wrote, Love without respect is just decoration. My daughter wrapped her betrayal in pretty words. But it was still betrayal. It wasn't easy to say, and it wasn't easy to read. But sometimes truth needs to be louder than politeness. Clara said the piece would help in court. Paul's lawyer would try to paint me as senile or unstable, but I'd already told the world exactly who I was. Lacey came by again that evening, but this time she brought a file folder and a handwritten letter. I've been working with Clara, she said. This is everything I still had. Texts, call logs, emails with Paul and Dalton. I took the folder, flipped through the pages, and nodded. Why now? I asked. She didn't flinch. Because it's the truth, she said, and because I need to know I'm doing something right. I reached for the letter, unfolded the lined paper, and read her shaky handwriting aloud. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I'm not hiding anymore. I looked at her and saw the girl I used to read stories to, the one who used to fall asleep with her head on my lap and her heart wide open. Then don't hide, I said. Stand up and finish what you started. The next week, Lacey testified before the grand jury, and her words were more powerful than I expected. She didn't cry, she didn't deflect. She stood straight in her seat and admitted everything. How she'd let Paul manipulate her, how she'd ignored her instincts, and how she'd betrayed her own mother out of fear and convenience. Clara told me afterward that her testimony tipped the scale. The jury believed her, she said. It helped reinforce your case, but it also made them see her as more than an accomplice. I wasn't ready to call it healing, but it was something close. A wound left open long enough can become a scar, and scars can still feel like victory. I sat on the porch that night, watching the stars bloom across the sky like they were just for me. The wind carried the faintest scent of sage and something sweeter. Justice on the horizon. Paul's trial was officially set for the following month, and Clara asked if I wanted to be present for every day. You don't have to, she said. You've done more than enough. But I said yes without hesitation. He looked me in the eye and stole my future, I told her. I want to look him in the eye when it gets taken back. Arlene offered to come with me, and Rosa said she'd cover the proceedings as they happened. They tried to erase you, Rosa said, and now your presence in that courtroom is the biggest sentence of all. I didn't care about revenge, not really. I just wanted him to know that the woman he underestimated never stopped standing. The courthouse was colder than I remembered, with long hallways that echoed like old regrets. I wore my navy blue church dress, not because I wanted to look pitiful, but because I wanted to look like someone worth listening to. Clara met me at the entrance with a quiet nod and a folder full of exhibits, her heels clicking like certainty against the polished floor. "You ready?" she asked. "More than I've ever been," I replied, straightening my shoulders like I was marching into battle. Arlene sat behind me in the gallery, hands folded tight around a notepad she'd already started filling. Lacey came too, sitting in a different row, close enough to see me, far enough to remind me she wasn't asking to be rescued. Paul didn't look at either of us when he entered, flanked by two lawyers in sharp suits and sharper expressions. He looked smaller than before, like someone who finally realized charm didn't count in federal court. When the judge entered, the room stood, and the silence that followed was louder than anything I'd ever heard. The prosecution opened with calm confidence, walking the jury through the timeline like a winding trail of breadcrumbs. They showed the forged documents first, then my original signatures, highlighting every discrepancy. The forged notary stamp drew audible gasps when Dana Bell testified that the notary had been dead for years. Clara played audio clips from Paul's emails, his voice smooth, smug, and damning. "Mrs. Garvey won't know what hit her," one of them said. I felt Arlene stiffen behind me, her hand covering her mouth. The jury listened closely, eyes narrowing, some taking notes like students watching a lecture they'd never forget. Paul's lawyer objected to nearly everything, but the judge overruled most of them. When Lacey took the stand, you could have heard a pin drop. She didn't flinch once. "I thought I was protecting us," Lacey said, voice steady but low. "But all I did was destroy the one person who ever protected me." Paul finally looked up then, the first flicker of fear I'd seen on his face since this all began. Lacey went on, describing in detail how Paul had framed the sale as a temporary fix, how he'd told her I was better off downscaling, how he convinced her that family loyalty meant silence. "I didn't know the documents were forged at first," she admitted, "but once I found out, I didn't stop him." Clara asked if Paul had ever shown remorse. Lacey shook her head. "He called it smart business, said my mom would forget about it eventually." Someone in the jury let out a low exhale. The judge asked for order, but the damage was done. Paul's credibility had started to crumble. When I was called to testify, I walked up to the stand with every footstep, reminding me who I was and what I stood for. Clara asked simple, clear questions. When did I discover the sale? How did I respond? What did I learn afterward? "Did you ever give Paul or your daughter permission to sell your home?" "No," I said, letting the word land like a stone. "Did you ever sign away power of attorney?" "Never." "And when you found out what they'd done, what did you do?" I paused, looking out at the courtroom. "I fought back," I said. Because sometimes the only thing louder than betrayal is the voice of someone who refuses to be silenced. There was no applause, but I didn't need it. The silence in that courtroom was loud enough. Paul's defense tried to spin the story into a misunderstanding that he'd believed the documents were valid, that he trusted Lacey to manage the paperwork. He claimed he never meant harm, only wanted to, quote, help an elderly woman transition to a safer environment. Clara shredded that narrative like a hawk tearing through paper. She pointed to bank transfers, secret accounts, and emails that showed Paul bragging about the sale before it even went through. "This wasn't a mistake," she said to the jury. "This was a strategy. And it had one purpose, to take what didn't belong to him." Paul sat rigid in his chair, his charm nowhere to be found, his eyes fixed on the table like the truth might go away if he didn't look up. But it didn't go away. It got louder with every passing day. By the fourth day of the trial, the evidence was stacked so high that even the judge looked impatient. Paul's lawyer requested a recess, then tried to negotiate a plea deal that Clara promptly rejected. "He had his chance," she said. "Now he'll take his sentence." That afternoon, the jury left the room to deliberate, and I sat in the hallway with Arlene and Lacey, my hands shaking more than I cared to admit. "You did good," Arlene whispered. "You did right." I nodded, but said nothing, afraid that speaking might break whatever spell had carried me this far. Lacey handed me a bottle of water without a word, her eyes softer than they'd been in months. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something close, something fragile and earned. The courtroom doors opened 90 minutes later. The jury was back. The verdict came like a weight lifted off my chest. Guilty on all counts. Fraud, forgery, elder abuse, and conspiracy. Paul didn't blink when the verdict was read, just stared ahead, like he was waiting for someone to wake him from a dream. He was taken into custody immediately, denied bail pending sentencing. The judge set the date for 2 weeks later and thanked the jury for their service. Clara squeezed my arm. "We got him," she whispered. Arlene cried for the first time since this all began, and Lacey held her hand. Not quite crying, but close. I sat in the pew and breathed slowly, letting the relief soak into my bones. Justice didn't always come fast, but when it did, it made the waiting worth it. I closed my eyes and whispered Frank's name, just once. When we walked out of the courthouse, a local reporter asked if I had a statement. I turned to the camera, straightened my collar, and spoke calmly. "This land was mine," I said. And no matter how clever they were, they forgot one thing. I was still standing on it. Rosa's article the next day called it "The Verdict That Shook the Valley." And within hours, my words were quoted across dozens of news sites. People stopped me in grocery store aisles, in church parking lots, at the diner. They thanked me, not just for winning, but for fighting when it would have been easier to give up. I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt like Helen Garvey, a woman who loved her land and wouldn't let it be stolen. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. The sentencing came quicker than we expected, as if even the court system was ready to wash its hands of Paul. I wore the same navy dress, not out of superstition, but because it now felt like a kind of armor. The courtroom was quiet, heavy with expectation, and Paul sat slouched between his attorneys like a man who finally understood the walls weren't going to move for him. Judge Harrell was a sharp-eyed woman who didn't waste time or language. "Mr. Landers," she began, "you orchestrated a fraud that exploited family, trust, and legal loopholes, all for personal gain." She paused long enough for the silence to sting. "You are sentenced to 8 years in state prison, with no eligibility for parole until you serve at least 5. Lacey let out a breath beside me, her shoulders collapsing slightly as though a steel rod inside her had just been removed. Paul didn't turn to look at either of us. He stood, nodded once, and walked with the bailiff like a man already counting the days. That was the last time I saw him. Outside the courthouse, Clara met us with a thin smile and a folder of final paperwork. "There's still some cleanup to do," she said. "Paul's assets will be reviewed for restitution. You may receive partial compensation." I nodded, not caring about the money anymore. "I just wanted my home," I said. "And you got it," Clara replied. "But you also set a precedent in this county." Arlene smiled, arms crossed. "Bet they'll think twice before targeting old women again." Lacey said nothing, just looked down at the sidewalk. We stood there in the sun, surrounded by murmurs and reporters, and I realized it was over. Not just the trial, the wait, the dread, the not knowing. All of it had finally ended. That weekend, I hosted a potluck on the ranch, the first gathering since before Frank passed. I cleared out the barn, swept the floor, set up long folding tables, and laid out checkered tablecloths like old times. Neighbors came from all over, some I hadn't seen in years, each with a dish in one hand and a story in the other. Arlene brought her famous cornbread, still warm and wrapped in a towel. Rosa came with her notebook but promised not to write a word. Clara and Dana showed up too, staying just long enough to share a plate and receive 3 different pies from grateful locals. Lacey arrived last, holding a jug of sweet tea and 2 pies she swore she'd made herself. She didn't try to make speeches or ask for applause. She just helped set tables and passed out forks. We didn't talk about the trial. We just sat together under the barn lights and let the quiet do the work. After the guests left, and the moon was high, I sat on the porch with a blanket across my knees. Lacey sat beside me, holding her own mug of tea, silence passing between us like a cautious truce. I start community service next week, she said finally. 30 hours a week at the local senior center. I nodded. Good place to learn how not to underestimate people. She smiled faintly. I think that's the point. We watched the stars for a while, the crickets loud enough to fill the gaps. Do you think we'll ever be okay? She asked. I sipped my tea. I think okay doesn't happen all at once. But we can keep trying. In the weeks that followed, I started planting again, not just for the sake of crops, but because the land had missed the work. The backfield needed turning, the flower beds along the porch begged for color, and the apple tree by Frank's marker looked thirsty. Arlene came by twice a week to help, her knees creaking as much as mine, but her spirit still stubborn as ever. You need a dog, she said one afternoon, swatting a mosquito off her arm. Something with more bark than bite, like you, I laughed. I don't need a dog, Arlene. I need peace, she grinned. Same thing, some days. 2 weeks later, she brought over a rescued border collie named Boone. One blue eye, one brown, and a heart big enough to fill the whole ranch. Boone took to the ranch like he'd been born on it, patrolling the fence lines and napping in the sun by Frank's old rocking chair. He didn't bark much, but when he did, it was deep and decisive, like a judge announcing a sentence. The first time he chased off a pair of vultures circling the chicken coop, I gave him a biscuit and a new collar with his name stitched in red. You're home now, I told him, and he wagged his tail like he understood. Lacey came by every other day, sometimes helping in the garden, sometimes just sitting with Boone and watching the sky. He likes you, I said once. He's a good judge of character. She smiled, not arguing. We were still fragile, but we were moving forward. Not as mother and daughter trying to erase the past, but as two women finally telling the truth. Rosa published her final piece a month later, titled, When the Land Fights Back, How One Woman Turned Betrayal into Justice. The headline made me chuckle, but the article made me cry. She wrote about the ranch like it was a living character, bruised, nearly lost, but ultimately redeemed. What Helen Garvey did wasn't just win a legal battle, she wrote. She redefined what it means to grow roots so deep, no lie can pull them free. The article closed with a photo Clara had taken. Me, Boone, and Lacey, standing by the old fence, hands on the top rail, looking out at the land that refused to be sold. It went viral again, but this time it felt quieter, like a well-earned exhale. No outrage, no firestorm, just respect. Spring arrived late that year, but when it did, it brought blooms in places I thought were long dead. The lavender came back stronger, the roses stretched higher, and even the pear tree behind the barn, dormant for 5 years, budded pink for the first time since Frank's last season. I knelt in the dirt, knees aching, hands muddy, and smiled up at the sky. You were right, old man, I whispered. The land always remembers. Boone barked once, chasing a squirrel with no real intent to catch it. Lacey came around the corner with 2 iced teas and a book tucked under her arm. You've got mail, she said, handing me a thick envelope from the county office. I opened it with care. Heart steady. Inside was the final deed, sealed and recorded. The ranch officially, legally, and irrevocably mine. The envelope stayed on the table long after I'd read it, like a badge earned from battle I never asked to fight. I ran my fingers along the raised seal, not because I needed to confirm it was real, but because part of me still didn't believe I'd won. It's really over now, Lacey said softly, almost to herself. Not just the case, I replied, but the fear, the knots in my stomach every morning. Boone laid his head on my foot, tail thumping gently, his body still but alert. The sun poured through the kitchen window, landing right on Frank's old chair, the one Lacey had once asked me to throw away. I never did. That chair held too many ghosts who refused to leave quietly. Lacey sat across from me, picking at a corner of the tablecloth. I can't thank you for forgiving me, she whispered, but I can thank you for letting me stay. I looked at her carefully, seeing not the child who broke her arm falling from the tire swing, but the grown woman who'd broken something far more difficult to mend. You stayed because you showed up, not because I gave you permission, I said. Showing up is the hardest part, she nodded slowly. I still don't know how to fix it. You don't, I said. You just keep living better than you did before. She reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. "I've been writing about it," she said. "The mistakes, the truth, all of it." I tilted my head. "May I read it someday?" "Maybe," she said, voice cracking. "Someday." The next few weeks passed like the land itself was exhaling, settling back into its rhythm after holding its breath for too long. I reseeded the eastern pasture, rebuilt the old chicken coop, and patched up the barn roof with Arlene's help and a lot of muttered swearing. Boone stayed underfoot for most of it, occasionally barking at shadows he didn't trust or sticks he found suspicious. Life felt simpler, not because it was easy, but because it was mine again. Fully, wholly, unconditionally mine. I stopped flinching when the phone rang. I stopped checking the mailbox with dread. I stopped apologizing for still being here. Frank's rocking chair didn't creak so much anymore. Maybe the house had learned to rest too. One morning, I found a blooming daisy growing right through the crack in the front step, like nature itself was starting over. Then came the invitation, a certified letter from the state legal board requesting my attendance at a regional elder rights conference. Clara had submitted my story as part of a case study on financial abuse and resilience. I almost laughed when I read it. "You want me to speak?" I asked her on the phone. "You don't have to," she said, "but it might help someone else see they're not powerless." I thought about the women who'd written to me. Widows, retired teachers, nurses, grandmothers, all of them stripped of something by someone they trusted. "All right," I said, "but only if I don't have to wear heels." Clara laughed. "Deal." So I packed my good boots and the story I never meant to tell. The conference hall was colder than I expected, and filled with people who looked like they knew a thing or two about surviving what they shouldn't have had to. I stepped up to the podium with a printed copy of Rosa's article in one hand and a folded photo of the ranch in the other. The microphone squealed once before quieting. "My name is Helen Garvey," I began, "and my daughter sold my $3 million ranch and handed me a $16,000 check to live on." A few gasps, a few murmurs, but I pressed forward. They thought I wouldn't fight back. They thought they'd buried me under paperwork and pity, but I dug myself out. I read passages from my article, told them about the court dates, the betrayals, the porch lights that stayed on too late. And when I was done, people stood, not to applaud a performance, but to honor a battle they recognized as their own. Back home, the porch was quiet, the air thick with honeysuckle and dust. Lacey was painting the old tool shed, a fresh coat of red, Boone supervising with a tongue hanging out and no urgency in sight. I walked out with 2 lemonades and handed her one without a word. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand and gave me a tired smile. "How was the conference?" "Hard," I said, "but good." She nodded. "I'm proud of you." I looked at her, not as the girl who failed me, but as the woman who kept showing up. "I'm starting to be proud of you too," I said. She didn't answer, but her shoulders squared in quiet gratitude. That evening, we watched the sun set over the far ridge, its light spilling over the fence line like gold sliding down old bones. Boone laid between us, ears flicking every now and then at the sound of crickets or wind. "What are you thinking about?" Lacey asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Frank," I said. "What he'd say if he saw all this." She tilted her head. "What do you think he'd say?" I thought for a long while. "He'd probably laugh. Then he'd kiss the dog and tell me I did all right." She smiled, wiping away a tear before it could fall. "He'd be proud of you too." We stayed outside until the stars came out, quiet and unhurried, just the way we used to be. I thought about what I'd lost, yes, but more than that I thought about what had survived. The land. The truth. The battered but still beating love between a mother and a daughter. The kind of love that didn't come with guarantees or conditions. Only second chances. The wind carried the scent of hay and lilac, and Boone sighed in his sleep like even he knew the fight was over. Lacey stood and stretched, joints popping like mine used to. "You coming in?" she asked. "In a bit," I said, rocking gently, the boards creaking beneath me. I wanted to sit just a little longer, in the middle of everything I'd fought for, and everything I was finally learning to forgive. The following morning, I woke up before the sun, as I often did now, not out of habit, but out of peace. The nightmares had stopped coming, and the silence in the house no longer felt like absence. It felt like rest. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat by the window, watching the mist rise over the pasture, the land stretching itself awake. Boone padded in quietly, sat beside my chair, and placed his chin on my knee like he always did when he needed nothing except to remind me he was there. I scratched behind his ear and whispered, "We made it, boy." A breeze slipped in through the screen door, carrying the scent of turned soil and blooming jasmine. For the first time in years, I wasn't planning my day around survival, court documents, or strategy. I was just planning to live. I pulled Frank's old flannel from the hook by the door and stepped onto the porch, Boone at my heels, and the morning light rising like forgiveness across the sky. Lacey came out not long after, her hair a mess and her hands full of two mismatched coffee mugs. She handed one to me without a word and leaned against the porch post, sipping as the sky bled orange into blue. "You used to hate mornings," I said with a sideways glance. "Still do," she replied, smirking, "but this one's all right." Boone let out a contented sigh and laid down between us, tail thumping against the boards. "I was thinking," she began, tracing a knot in the wood with her thumb, "about starting over, maybe taking a real estate course, something I can finish and be proud of." I nodded slowly, letting the idea settle. "Long as you do it honest," I said. "No shortcuts, no palls." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "No palls. Ever again." We spent the rest of the morning mending the gate on the southern fence, the one Paul once said needed replacing when he was still pretending to be useful. Lacey held the posts while I hammered, and Boone barked at every rabbit he saw as if scolding them for trespassing. The land felt cooperative that day, the dirt dry but soft, the nails going in clean, the hinges swinging true. "This fence has seen a lot," I murmured. "More than I ever thought it would." Lacey didn't respond right away. "It held, though," she finally said, "even when we didn't." I gave her a quiet look and passed her the next nail. "Well," I said, "that's the thing about fences and families. They're both worth fixing if they still stand." That afternoon, I pulled the last of the sale paperwork from my filing cabinet, the ones signed under forged pretenses, now voided and legally powerless. I laid them out on the kitchen table, not because I needed to look at them again, but because I needed to let them go. One by one, I fed them into the fireplace, watching each page curl and blacken until nothing but ash remained. Lacey stood behind me, silent, respectful. "Feels like burying something," I said, "like a funeral for lies." Boone whined and nudged my leg as if to ask if everything was all right. I leaned down and kissed his head. "Everything's better than all right, baby," I said. "Everything's free." The last page burned slowly, and I watched it until the embers winked out completely. In the days that followed, we settled into a rhythm, quiet but whole, slow but steady. I showed Lacey how to rotate the compost, how to tell the difference between fresh eggs and duds, how to read the sky like a weather forecast. She asked questions I never thought she'd ask, not just about the land, but about Frank, about how we built this life, about what it meant to carry someone else's dreams when they were too tired to hold them. I answered honestly, sometimes with stories that hurt, sometimes with laughter so strong it knocked the air from my lungs. The guilt didn't disappear, but it softened into something more manageable, like scar tissue that no longer stung when touched. Boone watched us closely during those talks like he was memorizing the new normal. At night, Lacey would read aloud from her journal, and I'd listen, eyes closed, heart open, never correcting, only hearing. Healing doesn't announce itself. It just shows up one morning and doesn't leave. The community kept checking in, neighbors bringing preserves, church folks leaving messages on my machine, Clara sending postcards from a well-deserved vacation. Rosa mailed me a copy of her book draft, an anthology of stories like mine, each chapter more haunting and hopeful than the last. She'd titled my chapter "The Gate That Didn't Fall." I cried when I read it, not because it was sad, but because someone finally saw me whole. Arlene dropped by with Boone's vet papers and a bag of homemade peanut butter biscuits. "He's due for his shots," she said, "but don't worry, I already booked the appointment." I hugged her longer than usual. She didn't pull away. "You saved me," I whispered. "No," she said. "You just finally let someone help." One evening, just before sunset, Lacey brought out an old photo album, the kind with plastic pages and handwritten captions. We sat on the porch flipping through memories, Boone sprawled across our feet. "That was my 5th birthday," she said, pointing to a cake with lopsided candles and frosting too thick. "I remember," I said. You cried because you thought 5 meant you couldn't play with 4-year-olds anymore. She laughed, then paused on a photo of Frank holding her in one arm and a fishing rod in the other. He never yelled, she said, even when I lost his bait. He didn't have to, I replied. He believed correction didn't need to be louder than love. We closed the album, hearts full and quiet, like the stars waiting their turn to shine. Eventually, Lacey asked to move into the back guest room. Not permanently, just for a while, she said. I didn't object. Some things don't need permission. We moved her few belongings in together, the same way we were slowly moving grief and guilt into something livable. She still spent mornings at the senior center, afternoons studying real estate terms, and evenings watching the sky like it held answers we'd forgotten how to ask. Boone split his time equally, trailing us both like a diplomat who refused to take sides. One night I found her in the barn brushing down the old stall doors, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. Some things you can't undo, she said, but you can still take care of what's left. I said nothing, just wrapped my arm around her and let the silence say the rest. On the anniversary of Frank's passing, we held a small memorial under the apple tree where his marker stood, polished and clean. We didn't make speeches. We just brought what he loved: iced tea, dry wit, and quiet strength. I read him a letter I'd written the week Lacey gave me that check, back when I thought I'd lost everything. Boone sat beside me, tail curled, ears up. Lacey placed a single sunflower at the base of the stone and whispered something I didn't ask her to repeat. Forgiveness doesn't need witnesses, only courage. And we'd both finally found enough of it to last. Thank you for listening to my story. Before you leave, there's another story similar to the one you just watched. You'll see it on the top left of your screen.